good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's SPRI seminar. We're very pleased today to be welcoming Professor Stephen Joseph, who's going to talk to us today. Stephen, great to see you. I think everybody's had a chance to see Stephen's impressive background and CV, so I won't talk for too long. I'm just very happy that we're going to get a combination of biochar, photovoltaics, and sequestration of carbon and water and agri-photovoltaics. But I'm going to hand over to Stephen and say, welcome, Stephen. It's great to have you and look forward to what you've got to tell us. Okay. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thanks, Alistair. Just to say, I did my undergraduate and postgraduate here. And I was involved with the solar industry from the very early stages, having worked with Graham Morrison. And it's been a long time since I've actually been in the building. I'm a contemporary of Martin Green's. We used to bump into each other, but my focus was more on solar thermal and wind and biomass. But in the last 15 years, I've focused on soil. I guess with solar PV, we know that it's carbon positive, it's not carbon negative. We also know that there's been some kickback from rural communities and farmers in particular about large-scale PV farms. But we also know PVs are great for collecting water, and potentially they're fantastic for growing crops underneath and next to. So I've been, and in fact I'm actually doing a project in the USA. It has absolutely no funding, and it's being done by a very nice chap who knows very little about PVs and biochar, but he's done an amazing job with no money. But what I'm really interested in doing is showing that Australia can lead in this area, yeah? You know, I've been through the stages where we've got money for PVs and then the money stopped and the industry left Australia. But we're really committed to getting the biochar industry up and running, and I'm personally committed to making sure that we can integrate what we do with biochar with PVs. Okay, the interesting thing is we've been actually exploring integrating bioenergy with PVs and wind for a long time. I worked with David Mills and Steve Caneff in the very early days, and then I did some work with ANU on this area. And the thing that most people aren't aware of is Australia has a huge amount of biomass. And that biomass is not native forests, it's invasive species, it's crop residues, it's green waste in urban areas, a lot of waste from agriculture, and a lot of that waste is not used, it's burnt or it's buried. We also know that there are many areas in Australia where there's a large amount of sunlight, but there's also a large amount of biomass from waste species. So when I started looking at this probably 10 years ago, I just said, why don't we integrate both? Unfortunately, 13 years ago, it wasn't possible to get the federal government interested. They were interested in hydrogen. And so, you know, sometimes you can't bash your head against a brick wall. So I basically stopped working in this area. But since we've had a change in government, both here and in the USA, it's become a really important area, certainly for my work. And when I read the story about Martin Green and the Good Weekend, I wrote to him, I said, hey Martin, what about we do agri-voltaics? And he said, talk to Alistair. It's something that I think we're all very interested in. The key message is, after 20 years and somewhere between 17,000 and 20,000 papers on biochar, we understand the science. We know what we can do with biochar. We know how to make effective biochars. We have good pyrolysis technology. What we don't have is the right regulatory system, and we don't have large-scale funding. And it's a big problem. Okay, so I just thought I'd give you a very brief overview of all of the work that's been done in terms of research and demonstration projects. We know that biochar will enhance crop yield. And we also know that there is a difference between biochar with nutrients and biochar without nutrients. The key thing we've learnt is that when you put biochar in the ground, it actually improves its properties. You know, it's like some of us who are over 70. Yeah, physically we mightn't be so good, but mentally we're probably doing pretty well. We also know that if you look at some of the ancient civilizations like the Amazonians, the Aborigines, they use biochar for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they use biochar to increase their crop productivity. I'm not going to talk about that, that's a separate lecture. Okay, so one of the big things that's come out of these meta-analysis, low temperature biochar, biochar applied at low application rates, biochar made out of grasses, straws and manures give you the greatest plant response. High temperature biochars are really good for water holding capacity. That's the simple message, yeah? The complex message is, if you want to make a really effective biochar, you have to design it to meet soil constraints and meet the nutrient requirements of crops. Yeah? So what we've been doing is to actually work on the engineering of biochars. And more importantly, we've been working on the engineering of biochars so they can be applied at a rate that gives a return to the farmer and to the producer of the biochar. The big thing that's happened in the last 3 years is people are now paying for burying biochar. You can get what they call corks, carbon offsets. Some Australian companies have got as much as $700 a tonne of biochar. Not many, but a few. So the whole movement to actually commercialise biochar has been kicked along because of the voluntary market where you can get paid to put biochar in the soil. Okay. So if you want to know about biochar, we wrote a paper about how biochars work and when they don't. This was a paper that was initiated by my colleague who works for New South Wales DPI, Professor Annette Cowie. She sits on one of the IPCC scientific committees, and she wrote the chapter in the last report on biochar. So she rang me up one day and she said, Joey, she said, we need a paper to convince all my colleagues who are sceptical about biochar. So we wrote this paper. It took us 18 months, about 30 drafts, and God knows how many revisions to get it through. But this is one of the most highly cited papers in the biochar field. What we were able to show is that when you put biochar in the soil, it actually absorbs organic molecules, and those organic molecules are protected. So you can actually build soil carbon, what we call negative priming, yeah? And you can do it relatively quickly. And I'm going to talk to you more about that because we're looking at how we can build carbon very quickly. I just wanted to show you this, it's a bit, this picture. This, I don't know how much you know about soils, but soils have aggregates, yeah? Aggregates are really important for growing crops and trees. And if you have really good aggregate structure in soil that has good water holding capacity, it has a wide range of beneficial microbes. And what we did, this was some work I did over at Material Science. We actually got one of these aggregates from a soil, and I got a very thin pin and I cracked open the aggregate. And inside we found a piece of biochar that was covered in iron nanoparticles. And I'll talk a little bit more. What's fascinating about biochar is, and I'll talk, it's a few slides up, biochar to some extent are like photovoltaic cells. And I'll come back to that. You know, my background's in material science and chemical engineering. I find it really interesting. I just wanted to show you something else that we've learned about biochar. You don't have to put it in the ground to make it work. I work very closely with the Israelis because they're the world's experts of growing things in desert conditions. What we found is that we could actually make a foliar spray. We could increase the nutrient uptake efficiency of a conventional chemical fertilizer. But what we found, this is basically a root that is full of fungi. And this is a leaf where these micron and nanoparticle size minerals have gone inside the stomata. And a lot of those minerals are oxides. Titanium dioxide, silicon dioxide, zinc oxide, copper oxide, a bunch of other things. But it's fascinating that we increase the efficiency of photosynthesis. Yeah? And we increase it in a very complicated manner that we don't fully understand yet. Okay. So, I want to just give you some examples of what we've seen. And I want to emphasize the fact that I don't eat meat, but one of the best ways of getting carbon in the soil is by feeding biochar to animals and getting dung beetles to bury the biochar and the dung. Yeah? And it's one of the things that we're really pushing. Biochar actually helps improve the animal health. We've done experiments where there's an increase in milk yield and an increase in weight gain. My colleague Tim and I are trying to come up with a biochar that stops animals producing large amounts of methane, a very difficult task, and especially when you don't have any money, but we're getting there, slow and steadily. The interesting thing is by just giving the animals 200 or 300 kilograms of biochar a year, we might be able to build soil carbon by 1 tonne a year. Yeah? We don't know. We've never had the money to do large-scale trials. I want to come back to this when I start talking about integrating agriculture with photovoltaics. Okay, so I come from an energy background. Yeah? I spent most of my life doing renewable energy. I went back a little while back and started doing a second PhD in microbial fuel cells. I never finished it because I got too busy doing biochar work. But we've just done some work that basically shows if you put very small particles of biochar on the roots of plants, you increase the potential difference between the inside of the root and the outside of the root. Now, for those who know what the Nernst equation is, which basically relates the free energy of a process to the concentration difference and the electrochemical potential, what you are doing by putting the biochar on the root is reducing the free energy, increasing the free energy, but reducing the actual energy that the plant has to expend to take up nutrients. That's the simple story. The more complicated story is the biochar is full of microorganisms. And those microorganisms do all sorts of amazing things. I don't know if you know Thorsten Thomas. Actually, I'll show you this one first. We were very lucky. We got a large grant to do some work. Thorsten's Babs, isn't he? I always get confused. Bees. Okay. Thorsten Thomas had a wonderful student called Junyi. And what we did is that we actually made a magnetic biochar. And Junyi was able to figure out how to label a very specific bacteria that grew in the interface between the carbon and the iron and nanoparticles that we put on the clay. And what we found is that this specific bacteria fixed carbon. In other words, it was basically working as a microbial fuel cell where it was getting CO2, it was getting other organics, and it was actually converting those so that they went inside the biochar and they actually were stuck inside the pores of the biochar. Yeah, that's the simple explanation. The complex explanation is in a paper we published back in 2015. It's called Shifting Paradigms. And what we know is that biochar is full of pores. It has large pores, 1 to 50 microns. It has pores that are less than 1 micron, and that it has nanopores. Yep. And if you look at it, it's basically, there are tiny pores that go in between these very large pores, and that the chemistry in each of those pores is different. There is a potential difference, and that potential difference has an effect on the plant if you put the biochar in the rhizosphere. Yeah. And you can sit down and you can write the equations, you can look at the electrochemical potentials, you can do a whole bunch of things. I'm trying to get together a group of people to do some very complex modelling, but I haven't been successful with that one. Everybody shakes their head and say, oh, this is a bit too complicated, which it is. It's very complicated. Okay. So one of my colleagues who's now at Adelaide University came up with this very nice diagram and basically said, when you put biochar in the rhizosphere, it becomes electroactive. And one of the amazing things about biochar, which Tim's doing some really interesting work on at the moment, is it can both produce reactive oxygen species and it can scavenge reactive oxygen species. Now, I don't have enough time to go through all the science. I just wanted to get across to you what a complex material biochar is. Yeah? I could have 20 PhD students and not run out of things for them to actually do research on. Yeah? There's still a lot of the fundamentals that we don't understand. Okay, so we know that biochar causes carbon drawdown. We also know that biochar can actually draw down water. One of my farmer friends actually built a trench, filled it full of biochar during the last drought we had, and he measured the amount of water that was actually drawn into the trench, and he couldn't believe it. Yeah, the soils had about next to no water, and he was getting 20% water in his trench. Biochar has a very high ability, a capillary ability to pull down the water. Again, it happens at night, and it depends on the relative humidity and a bunch of other things. But if anybody wants to do a really interesting PhD, I'm looking for someone smart to do some modelling. I'm too old to do this sort of thing. Okay, so after doing this early work, I basically came up with a set of hypotheses. Liquid organomineral biochar fertilisers applied at application rates of less than 500 kilograms a hectare can increase pasture and crop yield, soil moisture and soil carbon. In other words, if we engineer the biochar to give it both a mineral component and a carbon component, we can get these soil microbial processes really moving. And we can apply the biochar at a rate that is commercially viable. Yep. So all the early work with biochar was done at 25 tonnes a hectare. You know, at the moment you pay $800 a tonne for biochar. No farmer is going to put 25 tonnes a hectare on their land. Well, maybe there's a few, but very few. The other thing that we did some work with, and I'll talk about that some more, is that these trenches and wells where you actually put a mixture of organic matter, minerals and biochar act as hotspots for microbial growth. Yep. So the big thing that we know is that biochar can act as a catalyst. Yeah. And it's a very complex catalyst, but it's a very effective catalyst if you make the right biochars. The other thing we know about these trenches, Australia has major problems with nutrient leaching, barrier reef being one of them. We also have a problem when we get large amounts of rain, is that we get a lot of salt infestation. We have problems with our runoff from cities. Biochars are a great natural barrier to stop polluting land. Okay. So this was a model that I developed. One other thing I wanted to say. I work with a couple of foresters, and they've been doing some experiments with some indigenous communities where what they do is in the forests where they have a fire break, they take all of the biomass that comes off the fire break, they convert it to biochar and they put it in the ground. The reason is that if you've got biochar on the ground, it's going to suck out some water. When the fire comes, that water will be liberated and it can help slow down or stop the movement of flames. And this is something that the Japanese told me as well. Yeah, you can use biochar as to enhance fire breaks. Now, we've never had any money to try this out on a large scale, but it's one of the areas. So, for instance, if you had a PV farm and you wanted to sequester carbon and you wanted to protect it from fire, then one of the great ways is just putting a ring of biochar, and if a fire's coming, you'd have a truck and you put water on it. Because I can tell you now, I put a flame next to biochar with water and you can see the steam coming up. Yeah, you've got that temperature difference which lifts the water out of the capillaries in the biochar. So what I did is I put together this model which looked at how you can integrate biochar into different agronomic systems, whether they be tree, orchards, field crops or grazing. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that. But the idea is that also using these wells, you're building fungal networks. So the key to giving soils drought resilience is to build your fungal networks, yeah? And you've got to have some way of doing that and doing it effectively. So biochar works much better in the subsoil. And it works better because if you make the right sort of biochar, you can build these fungal networks. Okay, so where did all this come from? I was very fortunate to work with some farmers in Western Australia. These farmers had a vision of producing bush tucker to sell to high-end restaurants. They bought a block of land very cheaply that was full of salt, and so their aim is to convert this very, very horrible soil into something productive that you can see here. So one of the things they did, they used char wells, they used these reactive barriers. That's them digging the char wells in the early days. This is basically how they grew their trees. And you can see how productive that land became. Now, it was very sad because one of the, we were hoping to do a whole lot of long-term test work with them, but the gentleman had a stroke and they had to sell their land. So we lost our very good site. So we were very lucky that the federal government gave us a grant to do some regenerative agriculture up in the northern New South Wales. We started these trials in the drought. Unfortunately, we only had 2 months before it started raining, and then we had flooding and all of our plots were ruined. One of the joys of doing agricultural field trials, anything can go wrong. Blades of lotus, you name it. There's a lot of luck in doing field work. But this was the plot site. That was the early days. This is on the fourth harvest before the floods came. Okay. So what we did was basically we had a number of different treatments. We had straight NPK. We had liquid biochar with some organic fertiliser. I don't know if people garden, but you can buy from Bunnings a fertiliser called Charlie Carp. It's made from invasive species. I love it. We had a liquid biochar with standard diammonium phosphate and a bit of urea. We also had a treatment where we took manure from cattle that had been fed biochar. And then we did a large application of biochar with NPK, and then we had another control that was just the liquid biochar. Cutting a long story short, what we found is the liquid biochars applied at 200 kilograms a hectare gave the greatest response in the early part of the experiment. They continued giving that response in the second harvest, and then the rain started and we couldn't see anything. Yeah, it was a problem. But what we did do is we actually measured the soil carbon. And so here was the soil at the beginning. This was the soil after 6 months where we'd had a fair bit of rain, so the carbon had increased. There was no difference between the carbon in the soil with no NPK and with a standard NPK. But what we did find, albeit small, these liquid biochar started building carbon over and above what the biochar was that went into the soil. When we started putting biochar in with dung, we got a slight increase, and then when we put a lot of biochar in with some nutrients, we got a significant increase in soil carbon. So it gave us a feel for where we needed to go. Yep. Okay, so we were very lucky. We got an ARC linkage grant. This was done with Griffith University. And one of my colleagues, his partner has a farm in the south of New South Wales, in Berrigan, near the Murray River. We had 2 biochar producers, Rainbow Beta that makes a high temperature wood biochar, and Carbon Powered Minerals that have a biochar reactor that my son and I designed that was built in China. And so we wanted to actually do a trial over 3 years. We only got enough money for 2 years, but this is the first year. And the results, we were staggered. I want to show you. Okay, so basically the nutrient content of all the treatments was nearly the same. This is pasture yield, and it's in tonnes a hectare. So basically they got about 5 tonnes a hectare with no treatments whatsoever. We put NPK on, we got about 12 tonnes a hectare. With a manure and straw-based liquid biochar at 400 kilos a hectare, we got 30 tonnes a hectare. Yeah? over double what we got from MPK. And we were staggered, yeah? And I'll come back to why this is really significant for agrivoltaics, yeah? We actually now know how to make really good liquid biochars, certainly for pastures. I think we've still got some more work to do for other crops, but certainly for pastures, I think we've cracked what we have to do. The wood biochar didn't do so well. Right, we put in some trenches. We wanted to see. Now, what I didn't show you, when we actually dug the trenches, we found old Aboriginal sites that were full of biochar. Yeah. UNSW had a couple of PhD students. One of them, Adriana Downey, wrote a very famous paper called Terra Preta Australis, where DPI found some sites down near the Murray, and we analysed them over at Material Science. I thought that was a one-off, but in actual fact, this is a long way away from the site where we did the first lot of work. When we dug, the farmer dug these trenches, and I got inside the trenches, and I'm going, this is like the Amazon. It was, and probably those sites are 800 years old, maybe more. I mean, we don't have any money to do the analysis to do aging on the carbon, but they're pretty old. So what we did is we basically made these trenches where we put a mixture of manure, straw and dung and biochar, and then on top we had an amount of biochar. And the idea is to see what it does to the rest of the soil near it. So we do measurements away from these trenches. We sprayed some liquid on one side and no liquid on the other. And this was the liquid with the wood biochar, not with the special biochar. So again, what we found, 200 kilos a hectare on this side, 17 tonnes a hectare yield. No liquids on that side, 9 tonnes a hectare. So we're doing a whole bunch more work. The other interesting thing was we've never seen really good yields when you have 100% biochar. But what happened is the grass grew on top of the trenches. And more importantly, the trenches had very high moisture contents, whereas the fields didn't have the same level of moisture. Yeah? This is all leading to my proposal for doing agrivoltaics. Okay, so my concept. We know that photovoltaics can sequester water. Yeah, I don't know if you guys have done measurements, but certainly there have been people around the world who've published papers on water. And there's been various people that have done things at the back of the photovoltaics to increase their moisture capturing capacity. We also know that you can put biochar into cement to reduce its carbon footprint. So we can actually cut down the carbon footprint of the infrastructure. We can put it into roads, we can put it into road bases. We know that if you grow crops with biochar, if they're the right sort of biochars, they can actually, even in shady conditions, you can get really good yields. And I don't have time to talk to you about why biochar switches on certain genes and changes photosynthetic processes. It's all very complicated, and I don't fully understand it because I never did genetics. I have one of these people who reads a lot and then goes to the experts. The whole idea of this is to build fungal networks underneath the photovoltaics through a mixture of trenches and sprays. So basically trying to build up soil carbon. So if you look at most of the photovoltaics, the soils that they go on, they might have 1% carbon. But we know if you're clever, we might be able to build soil to a depth of 1 metre that has 5, even 10% carbon. Yeah. Don't know if we get to 10, but we know you can get to 5%. Yeah. So the idea is that photovoltaics become a hotspot for sequestering carbon and for helping plants to mitigate the effects of drought and increased temperature. And I think the science is pretty sound. But until you actually do large-scale demonstrations, I could not guarantee an investor that they get a return on their investment. Yep. We just don't have enough information. And don't forget, I was a CEO for 27 years. I used to do large amounts of cash flows and return on investment and business plans and board minutes and all sorts of other stuff that you do as a CEO. Okay, so one of the things that I said to Alice there, I would like to go out and get somewhere between $10 and $20 million. I want to build a biochar plant that can generate electricity and produce biochar, either on the farm where the PV is or somewhere near that uses local residues that aren't used for other purposes. I'd like to integrate that into large-scale water and carbon drawdown, and we have enough money to do really thorough monitoring and analysis so that we can prove to the rest of the world that and we can prove more importantly to the farmers that PV can help them as well as helping the rest of society. Yeah, that's my dream. Yep. I just wanted to show you the unit that I designed. We've got 5 operating units around the world now. They're small units, they're 300 kilogram an hour input. My son and I have designed a container unit. So you basically make the pyrolyzer in the factory, you basically commission it in the factory, you bring it to the site, you turn it on and it works. Yeah, and so you can knock them out. Yeah, pyrolysis equipment is too expensive at the moment. And the cheap ones that you get from China, the Chinese EPA, apparently, according to my colleagues, have closed a lot of those units because they don't meet Chinese EPA emissions regulations. So this is designed to meet Australian regulations. We want to show that we can actually generate 24/7 energy from biomass and make biochar. Okay, so what I did is, who would be involved in a project like this? We're collaborating with Deakin University. Deakin's has a PV farm. Professor Wendy Timms is one of the world's experts on hydrology and soils. She's a civil engineer. She advises the federal government, and she's done work on water holding capacity of biochar. Some really nice papers. Griffith University and the sphere of agriculture, and UNSW, of course, with PV and materials, and all the other things that UNSW is good at, the microbiology. So what I'd like to do is to get money for at least 3 years. 5 years would be great. Get an industry partner, go to the federal government and say, okay, this is something unlike hydrogen and a few of the other things that they threw mega bucks at. This actually has a lot of science, a lot of practical experience behind it, and meets some of the constraints of solar PV farms at the moment. Yeah. My vision is we have a large part of the land in Australia that is marginal for agriculture. We put it back into agriculture with PV farms. That's my vision, yeah? We've just got to persuade people to put the money to prove that it is a viable vision. Yeah. I'm also a very cautious engineer and scientist. Yeah. And especially given all the history of renewable energy in Australia, the ups and downs. I don't, probably you guys don't remember, but John Howard stopped the renewable energy mandate. I had a company that was relying on the renewable energy mandate. We nearly went out of business, and it affected a lot of companies. What we don't need is to get into this stage where we have a cycle, yeah? We need to get long-term funding to make sure that whatever we set up can be there to trial different strategies, yeah? Different sorts of biochar, different sorts of organic amendments, different sorts of agricultural practices, yeah? If you look at a lot of other countries, they have field sites, especially in agriculture, some of which are 200 or 300 years old. You need to have long-term funding to do this sort of work where you can go through the drought cycle, yep, where you can go through the flood cycle. If you don't have that, you cannot get an optimal set of strategies for different parts of Australia with different crops and different soils. Very, very important that these sorts of projects take a long time, yeah? It's a lot easier if you just want to put up a wind turbine or a new PV, yeah? When it comes to agriculture, man, there's so many things going against you. Okay, I'm going to end there. I don't know, hopefully I'm not too much over time.
Well, you've done extraordinarily well, Stephen. Look, thanks very much, Stephen. That's fantastic. Kaywen and myself have been monitoring online. Kaywen, can you tell me if there's any questions coming online? I haven't seen any yet, but Stephen, thanks so much. That was amazing. And I'm sure that there's some questions out there. Any questions for Stephen? Richard.
Sorry, thanks very much, Stephen. How critical is the inputs to the biochar to get good biochar, useful biochar? So can we use the wastes that we have? Do we have to mix particular with different wastes together? Do we have to use things that aren't waste?
Very good question. Biochars ain't biochars. We know the best biochars come from grasses and manures. Yep. The worst biochars come from wood. So, what can you do? I'm working in Cambodia. A very interesting project. The indigenous people were cutting down the forest because they're poor and they needed money. So what this organisation did is they started growing bamboo. Bamboo is a grass. It also makes an amazing biochar, yeah? And it grows really well. Not in all places. So the answer is, if you don't have a grass, then you need to grow a grass. But it so turns out that things like lantana, prickly acacia, which is a nitrogen-fixing tree, just happen to be invasive species. So if you look at a map of New South Wales and you go out west where there's a lot of PV farms, it's full of invasive species. You also will find poultry farms, feedlots, various other things. If you don't have that, and that's why I put in my model, you need to start integrating agriculture with the PV, with making the biochar, yeah? You've got to start looking at an integrated business. I didn't show the slide. There's a guy who I've been collaborating with for a long time. His name's Stuart Larson. He's got a company called Soft Agriculture. And he's got 1,000, I think it's about 1,000 hectares. He's got 600 cows. He uses all the residues on his farm to make, well, not all, but most of his residues to make biochar. He makes biochar coated seeds. He makes biochar fertilizers. He makes biochar animal feeds. And so he's integrated, plus he grows soy and pea hulls, pea plants. And he uses the pea hulls as part of his input into his biochar. If you, and I guess in a project like this, if we could get enough money, I would be putting that level of integration in there, yep. So that we would actually set up in an area where you could input externally, but also you could actually look at setting up specific, whether it be pasture type trials with animals so that you have the dung, or you started growing specific species. I guess that really depends on, you know, when you want to start writing a proposal, you've got to have a collaborator, and you're going to have to work with whatever's available on that particular collaborator. So I'm working with a number of companies now, and what we're doing is, I just came back from the north of Western Australia. They actually have a oil mallee where they're making eucalyptus oil, and they have a large amount of waste, and they have very degraded soils. It just so happens that there's a feedlot down the road, so we have access to the manure. So we've been looking at making special sorts of liquid biochar fertilizers that they can then put on their oil mallee, and they can sell and do a whole bunch of other things. This is the way we've got to do. I learnt from running companies, never rely on one thing, you know. You need to have diversity in agriculture. And the good farmers in Australia that are actually making a profit, either they're large multinationals with lots of resources, or they have a whole range of products that they make and sell, yeah? Relying on a monocrop is really a recipe for a lot of heartache.
Stephen, thanks so much. There's a couple of questions online, so maybe I'll jump to a question online. Steve Taylor asks, has there been any interest from the circular economy area of the Federal Environment Department, DCCEEW?
We've talked with them. Yes, there's interest. I actually just wrote to Tanya Pliberset's office, and I got this very nice letter back saying, yeah, we're really interested, and we're going to bring some grants online next year, and you can apply for those grants. So the answer is yes. Whether we can get access to that money is a question mark. I guess my thoughts were maybe ARENA would be someone that we could approach to start off with, but also to go to the environment section and circular economy. I'd just like to announce we've developed a roadmap. We're going to be holding a workshop and a forum on the 29th and the 30th in Parramatta. The reason we're holding it Parramatta because New South Wales EPA, DPI, and people involved with decarbonisation and circular economy all are in that area. I'll send Alistair the flyer. It should come out in the next couple of days. One of the things that you need to know, applying biochar to the ground in New South Wales is illegal unless you get an exemption. To get an exemption, it could cost you up to $1 million. Yep. Because of the requirements under the Waste to Energy Act. So the other thing we're involved in doing is they're looking at the regulations. the government has a policy on circular economy, but the waste to energy regulation basically stops you using most of those wastes unless you can get EPA approval. Now, EPA, like most EPAs, are under-resourced, so it's this very long process to get approvals. So that's our other big problem, is the regulatory environment. One of the things that we're also fighting is that they have all these rules about heavy metals. Yep. Some biochars go slightly above the limits on heavy metals, especially biosolids. But what we know with biochar, even the ones with high heavy metal content, suck up other heavy metals. But the regulations are totally content-based. They're not rate-based. They're not based on bioavailability. So the other thing that we're trying to do, along with the many other things, is to get the regulator to understand that if I apply biochar at 500 kilograms a hectare, and in fact I just wrote a spreadsheet model last night, for 1,000 years, for most agricultural soils, I would probably only increase the heavy metal content by about 20% in 1,000 years by adding a very small amount of biochar. Yeah? But more importantly, I'm probably going to lock up the heavy metals that are already in the soils anyway. You try and get that sort of thing through legislation, and you have a major job to provide enough research information to get the regulators to realise that biochar works really well. And I could give them 1,000 papers that have been done, mainly by my Chinese colleagues, that show that biochar sucks up heavy metals, dioxins, PAHs, PFAS, yeah, because of its structure. Yeah. But the regulators have to go by the regulations, and they're enshrined in legislation. To get legislation passed is a major task. So yes, the answer is circular economy, yes. Regulations are a major barrier to actually getting this to occur.
Great, thanks for that. I think we're probably getting close to getting last questions. Rob, is there a class coming in here after this, do you know?
I think we're reaching for 5 more minutes.
Okay, we've got a few more minutes. I know that David Eyre online has his hand up. David, I'm afraid we can't take any audible comments coming through online, but we can take typed comments. So if you get typing, David, we can try and post your question to Stephen. While you're busy typing online, any questions in the room? We've got a couple. I might go over here first. Thank you.
Thanks. So you briefly touched on the issue of emission.
So, sorry, as you get older, your hearing is not quite as good.
So you briefly talked about the issue of emission when you're producing biochars, and you said several facilities were shut down in China. So how do you address that? Have you done a life cycle assessment that this is actually better for the environment?
Yeah, we published lots of life cycle assessments. In fact, I put a submission to the New South Wales EPA. What I showed was what most farmers just burn their residues on the field. We know within an order of magnitude what the emissions are from great big piles of stuff going up. Yep. I mean, you see it when we do fire reduction, there's vast amounts of emissions. What I showed them is that if, instead of burning it, you put it in a reasonably clean pyrolysis machine, your emissions are a factor of 10 lower. Yeah? So it's different if you want to put a pyrolysis system in an urban area to if you want to put it in the farm. But again, the regulations don't actually differentiate between having something that's in the middle of nowhere versus something that's in a built-up urban area. Yeah. So if you want to get an exemption, it's a huge amount of time and money to get that exemption. these machines you can make to be very clean. You have two issues. One is the cost. So they want you to meet world's best practice incineration type emission standards. Yeah, but it's a little machine. You know, incinerators have 100 tonnes an hour going in. Our machines have 1 tonne an hour. To put all that pollution control equipment is, one, expensive, to capital-wise, operating-wise it's expensive. Then they want you to put online monitoring. Yeah? And so what then happens is it's not economic. Yeah? So it's this... It's sitting down and trying to come up with a system that you can make the politicians and the regulators happy, that means that a project will be commercially viable. And so they're all the challenges that we've got, and that's why we're having this forum in Parramatta. Hopefully we'll get the EPA to come along and we'll talk to them, yeah? Let's try and work out how we can use our waste biomass resources and build soil carbon.
I know there's probably one more question there, but maybe Tim, we can ask that question over lunch. That'd be great. There's a question
Lucas.
online. Oh, okay.
Okay.
You want to read that question out?
Yeah. Lucas Van Zweten's work for DPI with chicken manure. How does that fit? Okay.
Over there.
Yeah. Okay. So I was involved in that work. In fact, I work very closely with Lucas. We're doing a couple of projects together. Essentially, very quickly, what we know now is that poultry litter gives you the best results. Actually getting access to the poultry litter is quite difficult. I won't go into that. But what Lucas is doing, and I'm involved in this, is we're looking at using poultry litter biochar at 80 kilograms a hectare. Yeah. And making pelletized poultry litter NPK fertilizers. Yeah. And so the focus is, and this is what we want to go back to the regulators, we're looking at putting very small amounts of biochar, so please give us a break.
Fantastic. All right, look, thanks very much. Let's thank Stephen again.